Okay, let's talk about Alpine. Another JavaScript framework, right? Yeah, just what we all needed. But here's the thing. Alpine is actually pretty awesome. It really is a lightweight JavaScript framework that you can throw into any page and just add some attributes to your HTML elements to give them interactivity. It's not as complex as React. There are no build steps, no complex state management, just good old HTML with a little bit of magic. So in this quick video, I want to show you how Alpine shines and how it just might become your new favorite JavaScript framework. Installing Alpine is super easy. Let's go ahead and go to the Get Started and click on the installation step over here on the left. There are two ways that we can install Alpine. One way is to include a script tag, and the other way is to import it as a module. So for simplicity's sake, we are just going to copy the CDN link and paste it into our page. But if you want to include it as a module, you can run npm install and then add this to your JavaScript file. Now, for simplicity's sake, I just created a new folder on my desktop called AlpineJS. And what I'm going to do is just create a new file and call this index.html. We'll then add a simple HTML structure, and we will add the script tag to the head of the page. Okay, now in the body of our page, let's go ahead and just pronounce H1 instead of hello world. Let's say hello Alpine. And if we open this up in our browser, you can see that we just have the H1 of hello Alpine. And one way to check if we have Alpine installed is just to open up the console and type in Alpine. And sure enough, we have version 3.14.8. Now, learning Alpine is all about learning the different attributes that you can add to your HTML. One of the most popular ones is going to be the X data attribute. This is how you add data or state to your application. So I want to go ahead and show you a quick example of this. Let's go ahead and create a div, and we're going to use the x-data attribute. And inside of this x-data attribute, we're going to add a JSON object. So we'll add a key and a value. We can also refer to these as variables and values. So we'll say that we're going to add a message variable, and we'll give it the value of hello Alpine. And inside this div, we'll create a paragraph, and we'll add a new attribute called x-text. And this attribute allows us to display the text value of a variable. So we'll say f-text is a message. So let's save that, reload the page, and simple enough, we get hello Alpine. Pretty cool. Next, we're going to create a simple counter. So let's go ahead and create a button element, and we're going to get it in the x data. It's going to store the current count value. So we'll say count is currently equal to 0. And we're going to say when this button is clicked, and we're going to use a new attribute called x-on. So the x-on attribute can be used with any JavaScript event. This could be a click event, mouse over, hover. Any JavaScript event can be used with this attribute. So for now, we're going to use x-on click. We will say count. We want you to increment by 1 each time we click the button. And inside of the button, we're just going to give it some text that says clicked. And we'll create a span with the text value of the current count value. Okay, so let's save that. Go back here, and you can see as we click the button, it is incrementing the count. And this is great because we have our count variable, and you can see that every time that that is incremented, it gets updated across the board. Two-way data binding is very popular in JavaScript libraries. So essentially you have a variable, and when that gets updated, it gets updated in every other place inside of your application or your website. So let's learn how to do some simple data binding with Alpine. So again, I'm just going to create a simple div, and we'll use the x-data attribute. And we are going to store inside of this attribute name, and we'll keep that empty, and then we'll create an input. So we'll say input type equals text. Now this is a new attribute called xModel. So xModel will say, I want you to bind this variable to whatever is updated inside of this input. So when we make a change to the input, it will update that variable. So we'll say xModel name, and then we'll create a paragraph tag, and we'll add your name is, and display the value of name inside of a span using the x text attribute. Okay, let's save that. Go back here and we'll add Tony. And you can see as the value that's updated, it gets updated right here. And we could add this to any other place inside of our application. So the scope of this variable is essentially inside of this x-data. So if we have any child elements inside of this, we can leverage the data or the state inside of our x-data attribute. So I could say x text equals main, and now the main will be shown in the paragraph and in the h1 tag. Conditionals are very popular for being able to show or hide an element or running some additional logic. Let me show you how we can easily do conditionals in an Alpine application. So we have the x-data attribute here inside of this div, and I'm going to change this name to be a variable called show. It will just set this to false by default. Then I'm going to add a paragraph, and I'm going to say that we want to show this paragraph if show is true. So by default, this is not going to be visible. Let's say, hello, Alpine. Now you see me, now you don't. Okay. Now we want a way to toggle this paragraph. And I'm going to create a something button, and we'll just use the x on click attribute, and we will toggle the show variable. Okay, so now if we reload the page, we have this toggle button. As soon as we click it, you can see that the paragraph gets toggled to visible and it hides again. So this is a great way to show or hide any elements or any text. Loops are very common for displaying a list of items. Let me show you how to loop through items in Alpine. So again, I will create a div, and inside here, we're going to create an x-data object, and we are going to store an array of items. So I will just call this items. And then how about we make this like a grocery list of items? So we'll say milk, eggs, and cheese. Okay, so now that we are going to loop through these items, we need to use a new tag, and this tag is called a template tag, and this is just essentially how you would loop through items in Alpine. So we would say template, and then we'll say f-4, and we'll say item and items. So for each of the items that we have, we want to loop through and store each one inside of the item variable. Then to display that item, we can add a paragraph tag and use the x-text attribute to display that specific item. And let's test this out. And sure enough, if we reload, we get milk, eggs, and cheese. So very simple stuff. That's how you do loops in Alpine. Now, there may be times when you need to run logic exactly when the element is initialized. And luckily, we have an attribute for that, just called x-init. So let's go ahead and just console.log a message here. Hello there. And if we go back into our app and open up the developer tools, you can see that we get the message there. So one example could be maybe we want to dynamically change the items. So we could say items got push, and maybe we want to add a new item to the array. So we'll say milk, eggs, cheese. How about a salad? Let's go ahead and save that. Let's reload. And sure enough, now we get milk, eggs, cheese, and salad. So x-init comes in really handy when you need to run some logic as the application is initialized. There may be times when you need to reference a specific element inside of your Alpine component. So one common thing that people do is they will add an ID to an element, and we'll just call this btn. One thing that we could do is we could always just reference this with document.getElementById. So inside the init function, we could go on document.getElementById, and we'll call btn, and then maybe we want to add an event listener to this button. So we'll just say click. When that's clicked, we'll just say alert hello. So simple enough, we've just added an event listener to this button. When the button is clicked, we will get a message that says hello. So we click on this, and sure enough, we get the hello message. But it's not always great to add IDs. Say that you had multiple of these components in your application. This hard-coded ID is usually not the best to use. What you can use instead is a new attribute called x-ref, and this is basically a reference. So we want to reference btn, and we can reference this by using the refs helper. So refs.btn, and we add that edone listener. So let's go back here and click on the button, and sure enough, we get the same functionality. So instead of calling document.getElementById or adding IDs to your elements, it's very common to use a reference, and then you can use that with $refs.btn. When we need to reference an element itself, we can use a few helper objects, and one of them is the $el variable. So $el will reference the specific element that it is being called on. So let's say that we want to maybe add like a green background to this element. We say el.classList.add bggreen 200. Now, since we are adding a Tailwind class, how about we throw on btailwind CSS CVN. Okay, so let's save that. Let's go back through and reload, and you can see that the green background automatically gets added because we added this inside of our x-init attribute. So let's say instead, maybe when we click this button, we want to change the background color. So we'll say x on, click, and I'm going to copy this. We'll say that we want to actually remove the BG green, and we want to add BG red. Now check this out. If we go here and we click on the button, you can see that the red actually gets added to the button as opposed to the parent element. And that's because $el references the specific element that is being called from. Instead, if we wanted to reference the root element, we could actually use the $root helper. And if we save this, come back here and click on the quick me, now you can see that the background changed to red. So be sure to reference the $el objects or the $root object when you need to reference the element itself or the parent element. Okay, there are a few more attributes that I wanted to cover. One of them is the dynamic class attribute and the transition attribute. So let's go ahead and just create a simple show hide element. So we'll say div x-data equals, we'll set show equal to false. And we'll create a button with a quick event, but essentially toggles that show variable. And then let's create a div, and I may give this a little bit of styles. Okay, so let's go back and see what this looks like. Now you can see that we have that element here. You know what, let's go ahead and center this. There we go back, and that looks quite a bit better. Okay, so now we want to click on me toggle button, and then we want to toggle this element. And we already learned that you can do that with x-show. So we say x-show if show is set to true. So we click on the toggle, and sure enough, that shows up. So what we can do is, instead of it just automatically popping in, we could use x-transition. To the x-transition.opacity, and let's go here, click on this, and you can see that it has that opacity that automatically comes in. And you can use the x-transition to create a ton more of these animations. If we take a look at the documentation and go to the transition, you can see that we have x-transition enter and leave. And then down here we have some more advanced ones. It basically says once it's entered, have these classes. Once the enter has started, and then once it's ended, go to these animations. Let's go ahead and just copy and paste these x-transitions, and you can see what that looks like. Okay, we'll save that, come back here, and click on that, and you can see that those animations like scale in and then also have opacity. So that is what the transitions do. Let's talk about adding a dynamic class based on whether view show is visible or not. So we have x-show equals show. Let's go ahead and change this to have the dynamic class Typically what you would do is you'd say x-bind, but you can also remove the x-bind, and this is just a shorthand, or you could just say :class. And we're going to pass it an object, and we'll say that we want to have a BG, we'll say red of 200 if show is set to true. Otherwise, we'll do BG-pink -300 if show is false. Let's go ahead and remove this background here so we can see it as working. Okay, so we come back here, it has the green background. When we click on the toggle button, it then changes to the red. And you can see it goes back and forth. So this is a great way to be able to toggle classes on and off based on the value of a variable. Okay, so we've learned a good amount of these attributes. Going back to the home page, you can see that we have the X data. We learned about x-bind, which is the dynamic classes that we just covered. We have the x-on, which are the events, the quick events, mouse over hover. We have x-text to show the text value. There's also x-html, which allows you, instead of just being text, you can actually put HTML directly inside of that div. We have x-model, which allows you to do this two-way data binding. X-show, which either shows or hides an element based on the value of the variable. X-transition we just covered. X4 for the loops, Xf for conditions, x-init. As soon as Alpine is initialized, it will run this code. Then we have this other one called x-effect, and this will run anytime a variable is changed. So you can dig more into that. I'm not going to cover that in this video, but anytime a value changes for a variable, you can basically intercept that by running x-effect. We have x-ref, which will reference elements based on a mean that you give it. Then we have x-cloak. And what this is going to do is this is going to hide an element until Alpine is visible. So sometimes on a web page, if you see like a flicker, so maybe the JavaScript hasn't executed yet and an element is supposed to hide, sometimes you might get that flicker where it's shown for a second and then it's hidden, or possibly it's hidden and then all of a sudden it's shown. Using x-cloak on the element will prevent that from happening. X-ignore will simply just ignore that element from being rendered by Alpine. So those are all the attributes, and knowing these is pretty much what Alpine is all about. There are also some properties, like if Alpine store, which is more like a global state. We did cover $EL. We didn't cover dispatching events. The watch, we did cover the reference or the next tick. But go ahead and check out the documentation. It's all pretty thorough. And then we have the alpine.data, which allows you to abstract the functionality out into its own JavaScript in case you need to reuse that logic. And the Alpine store, which is essentially the global store for all of your state. But with the knowledge you've just learned in this video, you can actually do some pretty cool stuff. And if you pair Alpine with Livewire, you're really going to have some fun creating dynamic applications. Now let's bring it on home by creating a simple to-do list with all the stuff that we have just learned. So I'm going to create an h2 tag, and we'll just give us a title of to-do list. Next, we need to add our input, and I'm going to wrap that in a div. So we'll say input, and we want to bind this input to the data that we have available. So this will be x-model equals a new task, and we don't have any x-data yet. So let's change that. One thing that might be good to know is you can actually use the body tag to store your x-data variables. So we probably want to have an array of tasks, and that is going to be an array. And then we have the new task, and that value will be binded to the input that we just created. Okay, so this input is going to be a text input, and we probably also want a placeholder. That placeholder will have a value that says add a task. Then let's add the button that will add our new task to the tasks array. So we'll say on click. And one thing to note is there's also a shorthand for the events. So instead of doing x on, we can actually just do @click, and that will do the same thing. So here we want to save tasks.push, and we want to push that new task. Okay, so now let's go ahead and loop through our items. So here is our template tag, and inside of here, we'd probably just want to have the list item, and we'd probably want to, for a span, let's say x-text equals, and this will be the task that we want to display. So we want to loop through each of these tasks. So we will say x-for, and then we'll say task, then tasks. Simple enough. Let's go back here, and our application looks all janky. So we need to say flex-column, and that might look a little bit better. Get groceries, and we'll click on add to do, and sure enough, that shows up on our list. Take out trash. Add to do, and there we go. Okay, now what if we want to remove a task or mark that as done? Let's go ahead and add a button, and this button will mark that task as complete. So we'll say x-on, or remember we can use the @click. And what we want to do is we want to remove this specific item from this array. So we can use the splice method, and what we want to do is we want to splice it or remove that item from this specific location. So we need the index of where this specific task is located. So in order to reference the specific index, we can make a slight modification to our loop here. So we can say task, comma, index. So each time we go through the loop, index will be incremented. So now we can say that when we click this, we want the specific task to be removed from the list. And let's just go ahead and use a check emoji. Okay, and we also need to put this button inside of this list item, just so it's semantically correct. Okay, so let's save that. Go back here to our to-do list. I'll say do homework, add it to to-do, and we'll say took out trash, add the to-do, and now we just took out the trash, so we want to mark that as complete. Just did our homework, boom, mark as complete. So there you have it. That is AlpineJS in a nutshell. These are just very, very basic concepts, but I'm sure that you can see after you start hammering down these basics, you can get into a lot more advanced things and create some really cool applications. So I hope you will reach for Alpine anytime you don't want to overcomplicate things. You just want to add some simple logic to your application. Alpine is not only for small applications, you can use it in large applications too. But I think people have this concept that it's only for small projects because it's so simple. But quite the opposite. It can be used in large applications, small applications. It is just a delight to work with. So that's it. I hope I've inspired you to check out Alpine, and I hope you all have a great day.